Well, thanks, and thanks for coming back promptly. We're slightly over time, but we will catch up. So this session now and the remainder of the day focuses on the research being done under the auspices of the Applied Quantitative Methods Network. And we have two speakers in this session. I'll introduce them both so that there's no interruption. First of all, Professor Emer Smith from the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. I've known Emer for many, many years, and it's always fascinating to see not only how Scotland and Ireland resemble each other in many respects, which is the kind of romantic image we have in Scotland, but also how in many important respects Ireland is doing things so much better than we're doing them here. The second speaker is the director of the Education and Social Stratification strand of AQMeN, Professor Christina Iannelli. I have had the privilege to work with Christina over many years, and I cannot imagine my own research having gone forward in the last decade or two without working with Christina. A tremendously interesting person in her research. So, first Emer and then Christina.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's been really interesting working in AQMeN, building on work that has dated back in terms of Irish-Scottish comparisons for quite a long time. I won't say the number out loud in terms of my own involvement. Excuse me. As you know, there's a very large body of research on the individual and school factors that influence the transition to higher education. But there's actually much less known about how the way we select people for higher education may advantage or disadvantage some groups rather than others. There's two possible ways of looking at that. You could look at the impact of reform in the system of selection. So you could look at change over time. Another approach, and what we do here today, is to compare two systems that have some similarities, but also have some key differences in selection mechanisms. So I want to take advantage of the institutional differences between the Irish and Scottish systems to look at their impact on social equality and inequality in the transition to higher education. This table summarises some of the similarities and differences between the Irish and Scottish systems. They're similar in that they're broadly comprehensive at lower secondary education level, but at upper secondary level, really key differences are evident. There is much more flexibility in the Scottish system, so that students pick not only the type of subjects they study, but also the number of subjects that they can study. So there's a good deal of variation in the number of subjects they take. There's no restriction on the subjects that they take. They don't have to take a specified minimum, and there are, interestingly, in contrast to Ireland, no compulsory subjects. In the Irish case, then, there are 3 compulsory subjects: Irish, English and Maths. And students will take typically 6 to 8 leaving certificate, that's upper secondary exam subjects, the average being 7. There are differences too in the selection mechanisms for higher education. Both systems have centralised applications, but in a Scottish situation, subject choice plays a much bigger role, especially in the more elite universities, facilitating subjects that are traditional academic subjects that centre on English, maths, other humanities and languages and sciences play a very crucial role in the extent to which young people are selected for admission to higher education. In contrast, in Ireland, subject choice plays a relatively minor role. For example, there might be the case where you're required to have one science subject to enter a science degree, but otherwise the dominant selection mechanism are the grades obtained. So students' grades in their best 6 subjects are used, and they're allocated points, similar to UCAS tariff scores, for entry to third level education. Now, in this paper we draw on Irish and Scottish school leavers surveys spanning almost 2 decades, from 1987 to 2005. And it's an unfortunate kind of thing to have to remark on the discontinuation of both of these surveys in Ireland and Scotland. And we really have lost a very valuable data infrastructure there. So here we're looking at upper secondary leavers and whether they make the transition to higher education. And we're asking, does subject choice matter more in Scotland than in Ireland because of the way the admission system is structured and because of the flexibility in choices at upper secondary level? And to what extent that difference in the role of subject choice explains social inequality in the two countries. And when we're talking about social inequality here, we're talking about parental social class. So we look at the occupational group of the parents and assign the class on the basis of whichever parent has the higher occupational group. Now, this shows you the scale of variation in the social gap in transition to higher education in the two countries at the beginning of the period we're looking at. So you can see that at that time, participation in Ireland was slightly higher than in Scotland. But what is remarkable is that the social gradient is really, really similar. So that young people from upper middle class backgrounds are about twice as likely as those from working class backgrounds to go on to higher education, having completed upper secondary level. Now, to what extent is this driven or influenced by differences in subject choice? Here we see, for the Scottish situation, the numbers taken facilitating subjects. So these are the kind of traditional academic subjects, sciences, humanities, languages, and so on. And we can see that there is a clear social gradient, so that young people from more middle-class backgrounds are much more likely to take more facilitating subjects than those from working-class backgrounds. And that trend is there across time. And interestingly, I don't show it here, but when you look at non-facilitating subjects, which are a bigger mix of subjects, some of them quasi-vocational or more applied in nature, there is no difference in the number of subjects. So the real driver of social differences in the kinds of curriculum to which young people are exposed relates to the role of these facilitating subjects. Now, in Ireland, facilitating subjects don't have any institutional legacy. They're not labelled in that way. But at the same time, you can see that the numbers taking those subjects are very high because of the focus of the Irish curriculum very much on traditional academic subjects. There are very few broader subject spheres brought into upper secondary education. You can see some social class differences in the take-up of these traditional academic subjects, but they're not anywhere as marked as in Scotland. And by the end of the period, they're much less evident than they were at the earlier part of the period. Now, what difference does this make? What we try to do is unpack the level of social inequality and how much that inequality relates to subject choice in the first place and then to grades overall. So each bar, the first bar shows you the difference in the percentage participation between upper middle class and working class young people. It also takes account of gender and social type. So we can see that at the beginning of the period, the gap was 29%. When we look at what that looks like when you factor in the differences in the number and type of subjects young Scottish people are taking, we can see that that gap falls very dramatically. So a big source of the difference in the transition to higher education in Scotland relates to the take-up of facilitating subjects for the hires. We can see a further drop again when we take account of grades, but that doesn't show up very well. You can see the numbers, the white has kind of disappeared. But you can see that that is much less important than the subject choice per se. And what you can see is by the end, over time, we see a decline, especially between the 90s and the 2000s, in the overall total level of inequality. But by the most recent period, all of that inequality is explained by the subjects young people take and the grades they achieve. When you move on to Ireland, you see similar levels of inequality at the beginning of the period. We see some of this inequality is accounted for by subject choice, but much less than is the case in the Scottish system. And we can see a further very significant drop in inequality when we take account of grades. So grades are a much more important source of the difference in the transition to higher education in Ireland than in Scotland. And as in Scotland, by the end of the period, we can see that grades and subject choice together account for the differences we see in social class transitions to higher education. So what does this mean, really? We see that even those systems that are not remarkably different but have very key differences in their selection mechanisms and in the nature of upper secondary education have very different consequences for the transition to higher education. Subject choice explains much more of the social gap in the Scottish situation. And in contrast, in the Irish situation, grades explain a good deal of that social gap. And I think it's important to notice that this really shows a clear case of unintended consequences of taking different approaches to selecting young people for higher education and how that selection mechanism relates to the nature of secondary education. And so there are very distinct implications there in the policy sphere. We can see that while flexible pathways and flexible choices can allow young people to select subjects and areas of study that match their needs and match their interests, that there is also an important unintended consequence there, in that flexibility results in greater social class differences in the number and type of subjects that young people are taking for the hires, and therefore for their chances for accessing higher education, especially in the more prestigious institutions. So this emphasis on the importance of facilitating subjects in admissions criteria means that early subject choices in Scotland have very significant long-term implications for the pathways that are open to or close to certain groups of young people. So in policy terms, it seems that widening progression to higher education in Scotland is crucially dependent on the development and support for educational guidance from a very early stage. So that measures that focus on the moment or the point of transition will not be sufficient if young people have already made choices that do not facilitate their entry to higher education overall or to particular kinds of universities. In Ireland, though, we see a quite different pattern. We see that the main driver of social inequality in entry to higher education relate to examination grades. And the Irish system is very focused on examination-based assessment, which has been the subject of a good deal of controversy. I'll tell you that story over a long lunch break at some stage. So grades have taken a preeminent status in selection, not only for higher education, but also for employment. In this context, then, it raises the importance of educational supports to provide more inclusive education at upper secondary level, but we see from other research that the roots of inequality at upper secondary level go much earlier. And in particular, other research points to the role of rigid ability grouping and more negative teacher-student relationships in fostering inequality in educational performance. So what we have tried to kind of show is a sort of what you can learn from comparing Scotland with Ireland and examine some of the unintended consequences around policy decisions that are important to bear in mind, that it's not just a matter of potentially changing a mechanism for selecting young people, but that mechanism has to be placed in the context of the kinds of pathways and routes that young people are already taking. Thank you very much.